In the annals of UFO history, there's one name that almost everyone knows, whether they're interested in the phenomenon or not. And that name is Roswell. Roswell is an otherwise unremarkable city in New Mexico whose name is infamous across the world because of an incident that supposedly took place there in 1947, in which an unidentified flying object and its non-human occupants allegedly crashed in the desert and were recovered by the US military. Roswell Army Airfield issued a press release saying it had recovered a crashed disc, leading to newspaper headlines about flying saucers. And then overnight, the military changed its story. This is one reason why Roswell just refuses to go away. What many people don't know is that Roswell Army Airfield was the home of the 509th Bomb Wing, the Air Force unit that conducted the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. At the time of the alleged UFO crash, it was the only nuclear base in the United States. Is that just an interesting coincidence? Perhaps not. Roswell is far from the only incident in which UFOs have supposedly been seen around nuclear sites. In fact, there have been hundreds of reports of such incidents. And this has led many researchers to conclude that there's a close connection between the UFO phenomenon and humanity's development of nuclear weapons. And it's led them to ask whether there exist hidden forces that are invested in our planet or our species, or both. Hidden forces that may be concerned about our possession of these weapons of mass destruction. In this episode of the New Age 2026 series, we're going to explore the strange connections between UFOs and nuclear weapons. And we're going to see how astrology seems to confirm that there is indeed a connection between these phenomena. And a heads up, this is the point in our journey in which we're going to enter the domain of high strangeness, where we start to see that technology, occultism, and UFOs are strangely but intimately connected. So strap yourselves in and let's start another journey into the past to understand the present and the future. Before we dive into this, I just want to let you know that if you would like a personal consultation with me, then I'm still taking bookings. I use a variety of traditional and modern techniques to help my clients situate themselves in time, find purpose and calling in the world, and navigate these very strange times. And I'm also available for electional consultations where I will find you the best possible moment in time to initiate new projects and endeavors, as long as you're not building a nightclub next to my mum's house. Find the details in the description below. In the last episode of this series, we saw how the history of nuclear technology can be seen through the lens of the current Pluto-Neptune cycle, which began with conjunctions at 7 and 8 Gemini in 1891 and 1892. And that's because we can trace the development of atomic theory to that period. But as we've already seen in this series, we can also trace the modern manifestations of the UFO phenomenon to the very same period, because it was during the 1890s that there was a wave of so-called mystery airship sightings, first in the United States and then across the world. While the UFO phenomenon may well be as old as time itself, the airships seems to mark the first time that began appearing to us in the form of objects we could recognize as technology. Now, in the last episode, we traced the development of nuclear science through the aspects of the Pluto-Neptune cycle. We saw how the electron was discovered at the conjunction in 1897, the proton was discovered at the semi-sextile in 1917, and the neutron was discovered at the semi-square in 1932. And then in the 1940s, when the sextile came into orb, that knowledge was put to devastating use in the form of the creation and use of the nuclear bomb. What we're going to see in this episode is how we can discern a strangely similar pattern with the UFO phenomenon, because just like the bomb, it emerged in its modern form in the 1940s. First came the strange balls of light seen in the sky during the Second World War by both Allied and Axis pilots. They were nicknamed the Foo Fighters, which is of course where the band gets their name from. And in 1947, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and just as the Cold War was beginning, the phenomenon really kicked into gear. The first of these famous incidents was pilot Kenneth Arnold's supposed sighting on June the 24th of several disc-shaped objects at Mount Rainier. The objects were described in a newspaper as flying saucers. And so that term entered the English lexicon, and that image entered our imaginations. And then in July came Roswell. But these incidents were really just two of many sightings during what has been called the 1947 flying disc craze. Historians have documented hundreds of similar reports in the subsequent weeks, and some sources have estimated that there were thousands of such sightings. And so, as with nuclear technology, the UFO also appears to be correlated to the Pluto-Neptune cycle. In both cases, we can trace their history to the 1890s and then observe their real emergence at the sextile in the 1940s. Around these parts, we don't put this kind of correlation down to coincidence. But if you want more evidence, well, as the kids say, I've got you, fam. Because as with the development of nuclear physics at the minor aspects of the Pluto-Neptune cycle, we see key events in the history of the UFO phenomenon. And here's where things start to get really weird. Because it's here that we'll start to see the strange intersection between the UFO phenomenon and occultism. If you're finding this stuff interesting, then please do give that little like button a click and let YouTube and me know that. And remember to subscribe to the channel if you want to make sure you never miss out on another one of these episodes. One of the core ideas of this series is that to understand our times, we have to understand the late 19th century. And as we saw in this episode, one of the many notable developments of that period was a rebirth and flowering of occultism. Theosophy was the most prominent occult movement that emerged at that time, but the period also gave birth to more explicitly magical orders, such as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And one of the most famous members of the latter group was this man, the English occultist Aleister Crowley, or as he sometimes liked to call himself, the Beast 666. Crowley was born in 1875 as Pluto and Neptune were moving towards their conjunction. He was brought up by Christian fundamentalists, the Plymouth Brethren, and then seemingly spent his entire life in rebellion against that upbringing. He joined the Golden Dawn in 1898 and soaked up their practices of ceremonial magic. But soon enough, in 1907, he left the Golden Dawn to found his own order, the AA, through which he promoted his own religion, Thelema, of which he was, of course, the prophet. And rather like Madame Blavatsky, Crowley infused Western esotericism with Eastern thinking, borrowed from Hinduism and Buddhism, and he also believed he was in contact with disembodied beings, in his case, a messenger of the Egyptian god Horus named Iwas. And just like Blavatsky, he claimed that humanity was entering a new age, which he called the Aeon of Horus. Once again, we see the proclamation of a new age by an important figure of this period, years before Pluto was even discovered. Now, as we've seen in the last episode, in 1916 and 1917, Pluto and Neptune made 3 exact semi-sextiles. This is the 30-degree minor aspect. And at this time, as the First World War raged, Ernest Rutherford made his discovery of the proton, which was a crucial step on the journey towards the atom bomb. There was also an interesting moment in Crowley's life here, because in 1914, he had moved to the United States. And in 1917, while living in New York, he spent some time performing a magical ritual, which he called the Amalantra working. And in the course of this procedure, he came into contact with a strange entity that he called Lamb. And here's Crowley's sketch of what Lamb looked like. Now, many people have noted the resemblance between this entity and the so-called grey alien, which is such a staple of the UFO imaginary. Some people have even speculated that Crowley's Amalantra working opened a kind of portal that allowed these beings to enter our world. Now, I'm not sure about that, although honestly, we are in deeply weird territory here, and as far as I'm concerned, anything's possible. But for me, it's extremely interesting that at the semi-sextile of the Pluto-Neptune cycle, we saw this foreshadowing of one of the most recognizable images associated with the UFO phenomenon. But that wasn't the only strange incident of the year 1917 that's been linked to the UFO phenomenon. There was something else that happened that year that's interesting for our purposes, and it was witnessed not just by a lone occultist, but by hundreds of people. Some of the most respected researchers in ufology, like Jacques Vallée and John Keel, have come to the conclusion that the UFO may be nothing but a particular modern manifestation of a much older phenomenon that has interacted with humanity throughout history. And so they've taken a broad view on the kind of events that may well be manifestations of it. And one of the events that both writers have singled out is what's come to be known as the miracle of the sun. This also happened in 1917. In the spring of that year, 3 shepherd children living near the town of Fatima in Portugal reportedly experienced several visions of the Virgin Mary, describing her as a lady more brilliant than the sun. She asked them to devote themselves to the Holy Trinity and to pray every day to bring peace and end the war. And she gave them 3 secrets, which were prophecies of the future. One of the children, Lucia, the only one who survived to old age, revealed 2 of the secrets in 1941. The first was a vision of hell. And in the second, Mary prophesied the end of the First World War, but warned that if people didn't stop offending God, a worse war would break out later. And she also asked for the consecration of Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, which she said would lead to an era of world peace. Lucia didn't reveal the 3rd secret, but she wrote it down, and it eventually found its way to the Vatican. The Vatican supposedly revealed the 3rd secret in the year 2000. It described an apocalyptic scene, including an angel with a flaming sword about to set the world on fire. But in the vision, the lady's radiance prevents this. The same vision also showed a pope being shot by soldiers on a mountain, which the Vatican later claimed was the attempted assassination of Pope John Paul II in 1981. But not everyone is convinced by the Vatican's interpretation, or even that it revealed the full secret. Make of that what you will. But the lady also told the children that on October the 13th of 1917, she would perform a miracle so that other people would believe what happened. Newspapers reported the prophecy, and on that day, October the 13th, 1917, tens of thousands of people gathered in Fatima. And something very strange did indeed happen. According to countless witnesses, there was a rain shower, then the clouds broke, and what looked like the sun emerged as a kind of opaque, spinning disc that cast multicolored lights across the whole scene. And it moved in what was described by many people as a kind of dance. You'd be forgiven for thinking that this sounds very much like a sighting of a UFO. Of course, we don't know what really happened that day, but if we believe the many accounts, then we might conclude that there was some kind of intervention in the world by non-human beings, or perhaps the Virgin Mary herself in human history. And so 1917 was undoubtedly a hugely important year in the early history of the UFO phenomenon. But what about the semi-squares of 1930 to 1932? Last time we saw how that period saw the discovery of the neutron, as well as a decisive shift in world history when Hitler took over Germany. And it seems that there may well have been an important UFO event at that time too. And strangely enough, it's an event that has really only become widely known in ufology this year, when Pluto was in Aquarius. In June of this year, when Pluto made its first short foray into the sign of Aquarius, a whistleblower named David Grush emerged. Grush was a US Army combat veteran and US intelligence officer who had headed up a task force investigating UFOs. And he claimed he'd been told by dozens of insider witnesses that the United States is in possession of the wreckage of several crashed craft and bodies belonging to what he calls non-human intelligences.
We have spacecraft from another species.
We do, yeah.
How many?
Quite a number.
You're kidding.
No.
Grush made his claims under oath in Congress. Some of them were quite specific. One of them was that the very first craft that the US acquired didn't actually crash on US soil. It supposedly crashed in Italy. Grush claimed that some kind of flying object crashed near Magenta in Lombardy on June the 13th, 1933. It was supposedly recovered by the government of the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini and kept in secret and studied, including by Guglielmo Marconi, the inventor of radio, until the end of the Second World War. After Italy was defeated, supposedly the Vatican informed the Americans of the existence of the craft, who then took it back to the United States. And an Italian UFO researcher named Roberto Pinotti has claimed he has evidence confirming that this really did happen. Pinotti claims he was mailed original secret documents about the case by an anonymous source. The documents included government telegrams from 1933 regarding the landing of a, quote, unknown aircraft and demanding, quote, absolute silence about the incident on the personal orders of Il Duce, aka Mussolini himself. Pinotti was also sent a handwritten memo with a sketch of the craft. It showed a cylindrical object with portholes on the sides, which looks like no known craft in existence at that time. Now, should we really believe these stories? Is it possible that Pinotti and Grush are making things up or speaking in earnest but have been deceived by other actors? Well, I think we have to acknowledge that that is possible. But what gives me pause as an astrologer is how this seemingly very important incident in UFO history happened so close to the exact Pluto-Neptune semi-square. Remember, a semi-square is half a square. It's a 45-degree aspect. Here's the positions of Pluto and Neptune on June the 13th, 1933, and you can see that they were less than half a degree from perfecting an exact semi-square. Now, admittedly, that's not evidence that's going to convince your average UFO skeptic, but for those of us who understand that astrology really does work, it's an intriguing suggestion that something may really have happened at that time, because that was a key moment in the Pluto-Neptune cycle, which we know has to do with the theme of UFOs. But that's not the only thing that happened at the semi-square. In 1930, the Catholic Church declared that the miracle of the sun was of, quote, supernatural character, and ordered the building of a shrine to the event at Fatima. So we can see how, as with nuclear physics, the UFO phenomenon seems to manifest itself in lockstep with the aspects of the Pluto-Neptune cycle. And as with nuclear technology, when the first major aspect, the sextile, came into orb in the 1940s, we start to see the manifestation of what was promised at the conjunction. Last time, we took our first look at this archetypal explorer chart, which shows the Pluto-Neptune sextile coming in and out of orb. Now, as we've seen, the modern UFO phenomenon emerged in the 1940s with the Foo Fighters, and then came Kenneth Arnold's flying saucer sighting and Roswell and the flying disc flap of 1947. The sextiles began to go exact between 1950 and 1956, and between 1976 and 1986. And between those two periods, the planets separated a bit, but not by much. So this entire period was really the golden age of the UFO phenomenon. For example, in July 1952, there was the famous incident in which UFOs were seen to swarm around the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. Around the same time, also in 1952, the US Air Force launched its official investigation into UFOs, known as Project Blue Book, which closed in 1969. The UFO obsession continued through the 1960s and right on through to the 1990s. First report of an alien abduction came in 1961 with the case of Barney and Betty Hill, a couple who claimed under hypnosis to have been taken onto a craft while driving along a road in New Hampshire. If we turn back to our archetypal explorer chart, we can see that the second set of exact sextiles came from 1976 to 1986. As well as being the peak of the Cold War, this was also a peak period in terms of public obsession with UFOs and abductions. In 1980, the book The Roswell Incident came out, which popularized the theory that a UFO had indeed crashed in New Mexico in 1947, helping to feed the growing public obsession with flying saucers. That obsession is reflected in the popular culture of the time, of course. It was during this period in 1977 that Spielberg released Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and he followed that up with E.T. in 1983. Now, as we've seen, the Cold War ended in 1991 and the world changed dramatically. We went from a divided world threatened by nuclear war to one dominated by a single superpower, where the threat of nuclear weapons being used in anger declined precipitously, even if it never fully went away. And as I argued in the last episode, this seems to be reflected in the Pluto-Neptune sextile chart, because the threat receded as the planets moved away from their sextile. And wouldn't you know it, the same thing happened with UFOs. Our obsession with UFOs didn't dissipate quite as quickly as the Soviet Union. I think you could argue that it sustained itself until perhaps the late 1990s. Many of us will remember that decade for the X-Files, hugely popular show about two FBI agents investigating UFOs and other strange happenings. But I'm not sure the X-Files helped ufology's efforts to be taken seriously. The show ultimately portrayed UFOs as just one of a bunch of other paranormal phenomena, many of which, let's be honest, were pretty silly.
Surveillance of investigation team members is often utilized as a precautionary.
We found out you used to be a dog-faced boy.
Boy, look how skinny I was back then.
So that is you.
Oh, sure.
The show was cancelled in 1999, and after this time, we entered a period where ufology retreated much more to the fringes. It wasn't making headlines anymore. And whenever the media did decide to cover it, it would inevitably be accompanied by the X-Files music, which turned into a kind of signal, one that announced that this is fiction, this is a joke. I remember noticing in the 2000s that nobody seemed to get abducted anymore, or if they did, we weren't hearing about it. Here's an article from the Boston Globe in 2016 entitled, "Why Alien Abductions Are Down Significantly." As the article says, quote, "By the end of the 1990s, the alien abduction bubble had burst. Ratings fell for the X-Files. In April 2001, reports, later denied, circulated that the British Flying Saucer Bureau, 1,500 members strong at its peak, was shutting down after a long dry spell of no sightings." But it wasn't just the cancelling of the TV show that killed interest in UFOs. As the article says, quote, "5 months later, 2 planes crashed into the Twin Towers and no one cared about little green men anymore." And I think this is true. Ufology retreated to the fringe in the 2000s when the Cold War was replaced by a new global war, the global war on terror. And it was at this time that Pluto and Neptune really drifted apart. If we use an orb of 6 degrees for the sextile and add a horizontal line at 6 degrees to our Pluto-Neptune sextile chart, we can see that during this period, there were times when the planets moved out of orb for the first time since the early 1940s. Now, as we move closer and closer to those exact sextiles again, threats about using nuclear weapons seem to be back, as does the UFO phenomenon. So the astrology shows us that these phenomena seem to be linked temporally. One rises with the other. But ufologists are saying the same thing, because the UFO phenomenon itself has apparently shown great interest in nuclear technology. Why did the UFO phenomenon appear around the time that we developed nuclear weapons? Some have speculated that perhaps the first nuclear explosions attracted the attention of the phenomenon somehow, or even that they opened a kind of portal. In 1959, no less than Carl Jung published a book on the phenomenon entitled Flying Saucers, a Modern Myth Seen in the Skies. Jung didn't write about current affairs often. He'd done it once before in 1936 in his famous essay warning about the Nazis and their apparent possession by the spirit of the Norse god Wotan. And he decided to intervene once again as the UFO phenomenon exploded in the 1950s. Jung said the issue was simply too important for him to remain silent about. In the book, Jung wrote of UFOs that, quote, "Airfields and atomic installations in particular held a special attraction for them, from which it was concluded that the dangerous development of atomic physics and nuclear fission had caused a certain disquiet on our neighboring planets and necessitated a more accurate survey from the air." And in his book, UFOs and Nukes, the researcher Robert Hastings writes that literally hundreds of sightings have occurred at nuclear facilities of various kinds in the United States, and that many of these events are detailed in declassified Air Force, CIA, and FBI documents. Hastings himself personally interviewed more than 150 former US military personnel who described sightings of UFOs at nuclear facilities where they had worked. For example, there are reports of UFOs hovering over missile sites and sometimes even disarming or deactivating nuclear weapons. One of the most remarkable of all these incidents supposedly happened at Vandenberg Air Force Base on September the 14th, 1967, when the US performed a test launch of an Atlas D nuclear missile. Footage of the launch apparently captured a UFO appearing alongside the missile, by this point traveling at 8,000 miles per hour. The object zipped around the missile and then fired several beams of light at the warhead it was carrying. This is some footage that has circulated on the internet that supposedly shows this remarkable incident. It may not be real, but it gives you an idea of what is alleged to have happened. This is just one of dozens of incidents described by Hastings and testified to by retired military personnel. And it's not only nuclear weapons that UFOs seem to be interested in. There were many reports of sightings of UFOs at the Chernobyl reactor, which melted down in 1986, the last year that featured an exact Pluto-Neptune sextile. More recently, in March 2011, came the huge earthquake and tsunami that devastated Japan and caused a meltdown at the Fukushima nuclear plant. Many residents report seeing balls of light around the reactor before, during, and after the meltdown. And this was documented in the recent Netflix UFO series Encounters, produced by none other than Steven Spielberg.
This is where it landed.
As an aside, it's intriguing that as we return to a period of exact Pluto-Neptune sextiles, Spielberg is back, producing high-profile material about the phenomenon. And so the UFO phenomenon seems to be interested in our nuclear activities. And as we move closer to the exact sextiles that Pluto and Neptune will start to make once again from 2026 to 2032, UFOs are back on our minds. This issue has been growing in prominence since the US military started releasing footage of unknown craft in 2017.
Oh my gosh. Look at that thing, dude.
And it became turbocharged this year when Pluto was in Aquarius and David Grush emerged. But what does all this mean? Let's try to put it together. As I argued in the last episode, we seem to be entering a time when the threat of nuclear war hangs over us again. But as we've also seen, there have been dozens of incidents in which we narrowly avoided nuclear war in the 20th century. Enough to make you wonder if we're somehow being watched over, as if someone or something is preventing the worst outcomes from taking place. And that's precisely what we've seen in this episode. The UFO phenomenon, or some faction of it, seems like it may indeed be watching over nuclear facilities. And we've also seen that the phenomenon has made itself known at times when the world is in particular danger. Could that happen again in our near future? I think the UFO phenomenon is going to get much more prominent next year when Pluto returns to Aquarius, and it will only grow from there. There's been a lot of use of the word apocalypse in recent months. What apocalypse literally means is not the end of the world, but a great revealing. So imagine if we enter a geopolitical crisis in the coming years. And now imagine what might happen if we saw something like the miracle of the sun, but in the age of the smartphone. Of course, this is also the age of the deepfake, so we might not even believe something like that unless we saw it with our own eyes, but I think it's worth thinking about. Now, before we go, I'm going to show you some recent footage of the journalist Ross Coulthart on the Theories of Everything YouTube channel. Ross is a serious mainstream journalist who has been probing the UFO phenomenon. He has a book called In Plain Sight. He's put his credibility on the line to investigate this extremely treacherous subject, and he has some pretty far out things to say about it.
Why, since 1947, has there been a phenomenon taking an interest in the human race, particularly in nuclear weapons? Why is something or someone apparently trying to send us a message about nuclear weapons? Why is it that nuclear weapons are being shut down by what Slide 9 refers to as remote sensor disassembly? What's it trying to say? Imagine if, and I'm only speaking hypothetically here, imagine if future humans knew that if we continue on the path we're going, there's going to be a nuclear war or a conflagration of some time. Wouldn't you want to head that off?
Ross seems to me to be a decent man, but he's very open about the fact that many of his major sources are military and intelligence officials, and he's admitted himself that he can't know for sure if the narratives he's being given are the whole story. So we need to be mindful of that and very discerning about the narratives we buy into around the UFO phenomenon. In my opinion, the only sensible thing to do is to maintain an open but skeptical mind. Ultimately, this issue concerns all of us, and it may have a definitive bearing on our most fundamental beliefs, including who we really are and the true nature of reality. So it's no wonder that intelligence agencies and some pretty powerful people are highly interested and invested in it. Now, it goes without saying that I don't know how all this stuff will really shake out, but I can see a convergence of factors that will likely be a big part of the story. And these factors include nuclear technology and this phenomenon. But that's not the whole picture. because there are a few more elephants in the room that we haven't even addressed yet. And one of them is another technology that has, just like nuclear weapons, provoked fears that we've created something that threatens our futures. And that technology is, of course, artificial intelligence, AI. Just like nuclear weapons and UFOs, information technology arguably dates back to the conjunctional period of the late 19th century, and its development has tracked several big planetary cycles that are all reaching important moments in 2026. In the next episode, we're going to think about the phenomenon of information technology and how it might play a role in the events to come. Thanks for joining me again, and see you next time.